That fence is a violation of county code, Mr. Davis, and I'm reporting you to the zoning board. You'll be tearing it down on your dime, or the county will do it for you and send you the bill." The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and unwelcome, delivered with the smug finality of a monarch passing sentence. Karen Miller, the recently self-appointed queen of the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association, stood on the edge of my lawn, her floral print muumuu a riot of belligerent color against the placid green of my property. Her arms were crossed over a chest that seemed to contain all the neighborhood's pent-up indignation, and in her hand she held a crisp white envelope like a dagger. I just stood there for a second, my hand still on the handle of the lawnmower I'd just silenced, the smell of cut grass and two-stroke exhaust filling my lungs. Behind me, my golden retriever, Gunner, let out a low, uncertain whine from the other side of the very fence in question. A simple, 4-foot split-rail fence, the kind you see on postcards of idyllic American life. It wasn't a fortress. It was a suggestion, a polite boundary to keep a friendly dog from chasing squirrels into the adjoining nature preserve. Karen took a step forward, her sandals sinking slightly into the turf, and thrust the envelope at my chest. "This is your official notice," she announced, her voice loud enough for the neighbors on either side to hear. 30 days. After that, the fines start. $100 a day. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was breathtaking. I took the envelope, my fingers, calloused from years in the Army Corps of Engineers and a lifetime of working with my hands, feeling the sharp, bureaucratic edges of the paper. This wasn't a conversation. It was a declaration of war. If you think that sounds insane, hit that subscribe button and tell me your own HOA nightmare in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from. You are not going to believe where this went. This whole mess started not with a fence, but with a dream. When my wife Sarah and I decided it was time to leave the transient life of military bases behind, we searched for months to find the perfect place to put down roots. We found it here, in Oakwood Creek, a solid, well-built house on a 3/4-acre lot that backed up to a sprawling, untouched county nature preserve. It was the buffer that sold us, the promise of woods and wildlife, instead of another row of houses. The HOA at the time was a sleepy, barely there entity. The fees were low, the rules were common sense, and the board was composed of old-timers who mostly just wanted to make sure nobody painted their house neon pink. Before we even hammered the first post into the ground for Gunner's fence, I did my due diligence. I'm a planner by nature and a builder by trade. Measure twice, cut once is a principle I apply to my entire life. I downloaded the HOA covenants, read every single line, and found the relevant section on fencing. It was vague, stipulating only that fences must be aesthetically harmonious and approved by the Architectural Review Committee. So I drafted a simple plan for the split-rail fence, attached a photo from the manufacturer's catalog, filled out the official HOA application form, and mailed it in. 2 weeks later, I received a signed approval letter from the then president, a retired gentleman named Arthur Wellington. With that document securely filed away, I spent the next 3 weekends setting the posts, aligning the rails, and staining the wood a deep, natural cedar color that blended perfectly with the woods behind it. The project was a source of pride, a physical manifestation of the life we were building. It was sturdy, it was handsome, and most importantly, it was approved. What I hadn't accounted for was the tectonic shift happening within our sleepy little HOA. Arthur Wellington and 2 other board members had retired and moved away to be closer to their grandkids. In a low-turnout election nobody paid much attention to, Karen Miller, a relative newcomer to the neighborhood known mostly for her voluminous complaints on the community Facebook page, had seized power. She and 2 of her closest confidants now formed a majority on the 5-person board, and they had a vision. It was a vision of beige, of manicured uniformity, and of absolute, unquestioning compliance. My beautiful, approved, and deeply symbolic fence was her first major target. It was a statement piece, all right, but not the one I intended. For Karen, it was a statement of my non-compliance with a regime that hadn't even existed when it was built. And as I stood there in my yard holding her declaration of war, I knew this wasn't about the fence at all. This was about her establishing dominance. She had mistaken my quiet, reserved nature for weakness. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea that her chosen battlefield, the county zoning board, was the very ground where I held the high command. I let Karen's oversized presence recede down the street before I even opened the envelope. Inside, just as she'd advertised, was a letter typed on official-looking HOA letterhead, complete with a newly designed, vaguely fascistic-looking logo of an oak leaf being mercilessly constrained by a perfect circle. The text was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive legalese, a jumble of phrases like blatant disregard for community standards, unapproved structure, and failure to comply. It cited a section of the bylaws I'd never seen before, Article 9, Section 4B, Aesthetic Cohesion Mandate. It demanded the immediate removal of the offending structure and laid out the schedule of fines with cold, mathematical glee. My first instinct, the one honed by years of dealing with belligerent contractors and stubborn bureaucrats, was to remain calm. Anger is a poor strategic partner. I went inside, placed the letter on the cool granite of the kitchen island, and took a deep breath. Sarah came in from the living room, her face etched with concern. "What was all that about?" she asked, already knowing the answer. She'd seen Karen marching up our driveway like a stormtrooper on a mission. I explained the situation, handing her the letter. She read it, her brow furrowed. "But we got it approved," she said, her voice a mix of confusion and indignation. "I know," I replied, pulling out the file folder where I keep all our important house documents. I retrieved the original approval letter, signed by Arthur Wellington, its paper already slightly yellowed, a relic from a more reasonable era. "This is our first move," I said, placing the old letter next to Karen's new one. "We play by the rules. We present the evidence. We assume, for the record, that this is just a simple misunderstanding." Sarah looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you really think it is?" she asked. I shook my head slowly. "No, but we have to act like it is. We have to build a case, and the first brick in that wall is demonstrating that we are the reasonable ones." That evening, I composed a polite, almost deferential email to the HOA board, with Karen's email address in the to field. I wrote that I was in receipt of their letter, and that I believed there must be a clerical error. I attached a high-resolution scan of the original, signed approval form for our fence. I ended it with a simple, non-confrontational line. "I trust this clears up any confusion, but please let me know if you require any further documentation from our end." I hit send and felt a small, grim satisfaction. The ball was in her court. Her response came less than 24 hours later. It was not an apology. It was not a retraction. It was an escalation. "Mr. Davis," the email began, dripping with condescension, "the approval you attached is null and void. The previous board was notoriously lax and operated outside the spirit of the community's founding principles. The current board, under my leadership, has undertaken a comprehensive review of all past architectural decisions and has rescinded any and all approvals that conflict with the newly ratified aesthetic cohesion mandate." Attached to the email was a PDF document, Oakwood Creek HOA Architectural Guidelines, Revised Edition. It was 27 pages long. My simple split-rail fence was now in violation of at least 4 new, ludicrously specific rules. Fences could not be made of rustic wood. Fence posts had to be capped with a specific type of pyramid-style decorative finial. The color had to be either pure white or obsidian black from a pre-approved paint supplier. And most absurdly, fences bordering community green spaces, which our property did, were now prohibited entirely. This wasn't just an overreach. It was a retroactive rewriting of history. It was a power play so naked and unsubtle that it was almost comical. The dry humor of the situation was a small, bitter pill. She was trying to unapprove something that was already built and paid for, based on rules she invented last week. The anger I'd been suppressing began to smolder. This woman hadn't just insulted my fence. She'd insulted my intelligence. She was counting on me to be a typical homeowner, cowed by official-looking letters, too busy or too intimidated to fight back. She was assuming I would just sigh, curse under my breath, and spend a weekend tearing down my own property. That was her second mistake. My resolve hardened into something cold and sharp. This was no longer about offense, it was about principle. It was about the kind of quiet, insidious tyranny that can take root in any community if good people decide it's easier to comply than to resist. I looked at Sarah, who had read the email over my shoulder. "Okay," I said, my voice low and steady. Phase 2. The time for polite emails was over. Karen had made it clear that she wasn't interested in reason or evidence, she was interested in power. And so my objective shifted. It was no longer about saving my fence. It was about dismantling her corrupt little empire piece by painstaking piece. My military training had taught me that before you launch an offensive, you gather intelligence. You map the terrain. You identify the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, and you find the vulnerabilities they don't even know they have. My new battlefield was the Oakwood Creek subdivision, and my weapon of choice was a simple spiral-bound notebook and a digital camera. I started by going to the county clerk's office. HOAs, for all their self-importance, are corporations. They are bound by state laws and their own founding documents, and they are required to file public records. I spent an entire afternoon poring over microfiche and dusty binders, requesting copies of Oakwood Creek's Articles of Incorporation, its original bylaws, and every set of meeting minutes that had been filed since its inception. I paid for copies of everything, creating a thick dossier that became my operational Bible. The original bylaws were a revelation. They were clear, fair, and contained specific clauses about how rules could be amended, requiring a 2/3 vote of the entire membership at a specially convened meeting, not a unilateral decree from a power-hungry president. Karen's aesthetic cohesion mandate was a legal fiction. She and her 2 cronies on the board had simply voted it into existence in one of their closed-door sessions, a flagrant violation of the association's own governing documents. Next, I took my investigation to the streets. For a week, I spent an hour every evening after work walking the entire neighborhood, all 6 sprawling streets of it. I wasn't just getting exercise, I was conducting reconnaissance. With my notebook in hand, I meticulously documented every single property, comparing it against Karen's draconian new guidelines. I took hundreds of photos, all time-stamped and geotagged. The hypocrisy was staggering. Karen's own house, a large 2-story colonial at the end of a prim little cul-de-sac, was in violation of at least 5 of her new rules. Her mailbox was a non-approved shade of forest green. She had decorative plastic flamingos in her flower bed, a clear violation of the no lawn ornaments clause. Her driveway floodlights were the wrong wattage and style. It was a classic case of rules for thee, but not for me. But my investigation wasn't just about Karen. I started to gently, cautiously talk to my neighbors. I started with Jim, a fellow veteran who lived 2 doors down. He was a retired Marine, and I knew I could count on his discretion. I laid out the situation for him over a beer on his back patio. He listened intently, his face growing grim. "Son," he said when I was finished, "this isn't an HOA, it's a protection racket. What do you need?" His support was a balm. But not everyone was so bold. My next stop was Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. I'd seen Karen's car parked in front of her house several times. When I knocked on her door, she opened it a crack, her eyes wide with fear. It took some gentle coaxing, but she eventually invited me in. Her house was filled with the scent of lavender and old books. With tears in her eyes, she showed me a stack of violation notices from Karen. The offense? The trim on her windows was colonial white, not the newly mandated Swiss coffee. The fines were already up to $600. She told me, Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice trembling, that if I don't pay, they'll put a lien on my home. This is all I have, Mr. Davis. That was it. That was the moment my controlled, strategic anger ignited into a cold, white-hot fury. This wasn't about a fence or paint colors anymore. This was about a bully preying on the most vulnerable member of our community. I reassured Mrs. Gable that what Karen was doing was illegal and that I was going to help her fight it. I left her house with a fire in my belly and a new, more urgent sense of mission. I was no longer just defending my property. I was liberating my neighborhood. The file on Karen grew thicker. I had the legal documents, the photographic evidence of her hypocrisy, and now the human cost of her reign. I was building a case so airtight, so overwhelming, that when the time came, her little kingdom of beige would crumble under its own weight. Exactly 2 weeks after Karen's last email, the next shoe dropped, precisely as I had anticipated. The mailman delivered a certified letter, the kind that requires a signature and immediately puts a knot in your stomach. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from the County Planning and Zoning Department. And the return address was the county government complex where I spent every third Thursday of the month. I signed the little green card for the mailman, a grim smile playing on my lips. This was it. The escalation I'd been waiting for. The move that would take this conflict from a petty neighborhood squabble to an official proceeding on my home turf. I went to my office, the small room at the back of the house that overlooked the very fence at the heart of the matter. I slit the envelope open with a letter opener, my movements calm and deliberate. The letter was formal, dry, and utterly predictable. It was a notice of zoning violation and order to comply. It stated that a complaint had been filed by Ms. Karen Miller in her capacity as president of the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association, alleging that the fence at 1287 Willow Lane was in violation of 2 specific county ordinances, one related to height restrictions and another concerning setbacks from a protected conservation area. The letter informed me that a county inspector would be visiting the property within 10 business days, after which a report would be filed. Based on that report, I would either be ordered to remove the fence or the matter would be scheduled for a formal hearing before the County Zoning Board of Appeals to adjudicate the dispute. I read the letter twice, a feeling of dark, ironic satisfaction washing over me. Karen, in her blind arrogance, had done exactly what I'd hoped she would. She had taken her little war out of her private kingdom and into the public square, a domain where her self-proclaimed authority meant nothing, and the actual law was king. More than that, she had delivered herself bound and gagged into my hands. I leaned back in my chair and looked up at the wall. Hanging directly above my monitor was a handsome dark wood plaque with neatly engraved brass lettering. It read, "Mark Davis, Chairman, County Zoning Board of Appeals, appointed 2018. I let out a short, sharp laugh. The sound was swallowed by the quiet of the room. It was perfect. She had reported me to myself. Her confidence was so absolute, her belief in her own power so unshakable, that she hadn't bothered to do the most basic 5-minute Google search on the man she was trying to steamroll. She saw a quiet veteran who kept to himself and assumed he was a pushover. She had no idea that my quiet was the result of discipline, or that I spent my evenings reading dense zoning codes and case law for the sheer civic satisfaction of it. I picked up the phone and dialed the direct line for Dave Jensen, the county's head planner. Dave and I had worked together for years. He was a straight arrow, no-nonsense guy who knew the county code backward and forward. "Dave, Mark Davis here," I said when he answered. "Hey, Mark, what can I do for you?" "Don't tell me someone's trying to build a new cell tower disguised as a pine tree again," I chuckled. "Not this time." "Hey, quick procedural question for you. I'm looking at a standard violation notice. Complaint filed by a third party, alleges a setback violation. What's the typical process flow on that?" I kept my voice neutral, academic. I didn't want to tip my hand just yet. Dave sighed, the sound of a man who dealt with this stuff all day. "Well, you know the drill, Mark. The complaint comes in, we generate the notice to the property owner, An inspector goes out, takes measurements, shoots some photos. They write up a report. If it's a clear violation, we issue an order to comply. If it's ambiguous or if the property owner disputes the finding, it gets kicked up to a hearing. He paused. A hearing before your board, of course. Right. That's what I thought, I said. Just wanted to refresh my memory. Thanks, Dave. No problem. See you at the meeting on the 18th? Wouldn't miss it, I said, and hung up. I stared at the violation notice in my hand. Karen had loaded the weapon, aimed it at my head, and was now demanding that I pull the trigger. She thought she was trapping me. In reality, she had just walked straight into mine. The key to a successful counteroffensive is patience. Karen expected me to panic, to call her, to argue, to make a scene. I did none of those things. I treated the county's notice with the calm professionalism it deserved. I did not call the planning department to announce who I was. I did not try to pull strings. Instead, I prepared. I let the official process play out exactly as it was designed to because I knew the process was on my side. 5 days later, a white county vehicle pulled up to my curb. A man in a polo shirt with a county logo embroidered on it got out, clipboard in hand. This was the inspector. I met him at the door before he could ring the bell. You must be here about the fence, I said with a friendly smile. Mark Davis, I'm the homeowner. He was a young guy, probably just a few years out of college, earnest, and a little nervous to be on a potential confrontation site. Yes, sir, Frank Miller, he said, shaking my hand. Just need to take a few measurements and some pictures for the file. Of course, I said, I'm happy to help. I have the official property survey from when we bought the place, if that would make it easier to find the pins. Frank's eyes lit up. You do? That would be amazing. Most people have no idea where their plot lines actually are. I led him to my office and unrolled the large survey map on my desk. It was a detailed document, prepared by a licensed surveyor, showing every boundary, easement, and setback line with precise, legally binding measurements. I pointed to the rear of the property. As you can see, the conservation easement begins 10 feet from the property line. The county ordinance 117-4A requires a 5-foot setback from a conservation easement for any structure under 6 feet tall. I was quoting the code from memory, but my tone was casual, as if I were just a well-informed homeowner. My fence, I continued, tapping a line on the survey, is located exactly 7 feet from the easement line, and as you can see, it's a 4-foot fence. Frank looked from the survey to me, impressed. You've done your homework. I just smiled. I believe in being prepared. He spent the next 20 minutes outside with his laser measure and camera confirming everything I'd just shown him on paper. I left him to his work. When he was done, he knocked on the door again. Well, Mr. Davis, he said, as far as I can tell, everything appears to be in perfect compliance with the county code. The complaint cited the wrong ordinance for your zoning type, and even if it had been the right one, you're not in violation of it. I appreciate you taking the time to be so thorough, Frank, I said. So what happens now? I'll file my report, he explained. It'll state that no violation was found. Normally, that would be the end of it. The case would be closed, but since the complainant was an HOA, they have the right to appeal my finding and demand a full board hearing. I see, I said, my face a mask of neutral interest. And who would they appeal to? The Zoning Board of Appeal, Longin, he said, oblivious. Thank you, Frank. You've been very helpful. As he drove away, I knew Karen's pride would never let her accept the inspector's report. She would appeal. She had to. Her authority depended on it. With the county's process moving along its predictable track, I turned my attention back to the HOA. It was time to spring the other part of my trap. I took the petition I'd been preparing, the one demanding a full financial audit of the HOA, as permitted by Article 12 of the original bylaws if signed by 15% of homeowners, and spent the next 3 evenings visiting the neighbors I hadn't yet spoken to. Armed with my binder of evidence, the photos of Karen's own violations, a copy of Mrs. Gable's fines, the proof that the aesthetic mandate was illegitimate, I didn't have to do much convincing. The story sold itself. People were angry. They were tired of the bullying, the threatening letters, the general atmosphere of paranoia that had descended on our once peaceful neighborhood. I easily collected signatures from over 40% of the homeowners. The following Monday, I sent the signed petition via certified mail to the HOA's official address, addressed to the board of directors. It was a legal broadside, a direct challenge to Karen's authority and financial management. Now she was fighting a war on two fronts, a public one she was about to lose spectacularly and an internal one that threatened to expose any and all skeletons in her closet. I could almost feel the panic radiating from her cul-de-sac. She had wanted a fight, and now she had one. But it wasn't the one she'd been expecting. She thought she was punching down at a lone dissenter. She was about to find out she was in the ring with an entire community, and the referee was the very man she was trying to knock out. Karen's reaction to the audit petition was exactly as explosive and ill-conceived as I had predicted. Less than a day after the certified letter was delivered, a mass email landed in the inbox of every single homeowner in Oakwood Creek. The subject line, in all caps, read, "An urgent message regarding a threat to our community." The body of the email was a masterclass in projection and gaslighting. In it, Karen painted me as a disgruntled and disruptive individual who, unwilling to comply with basic community standards, had resorted to a campaign of harassment and misinformation against the duly elected board. She claimed my fence was a dangerous eyesore, and that my efforts to demand financial transparency were nothing more than a malicious attempt to bankrupt the HOA with frivolous administrative costs. She urged residents to stand with your board against this divisive attack, and to disregard any falsehoods I might be spreading. It was a declaration of open civil war, and it was the single greatest strategic gift she could have given me. The email backfired on a scale that was truly magnificent to behold. Her attempt to isolate me and paint me as a lone wolf had the opposite effect. It alerted the entire neighborhood that something significant was happening. My phone started ringing off the hook. Neighbors I had spoken to were furious, feeling their intelligence had been insulted. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to were now intensely curious, wanting to know what this was all about. The disruptive element she had tried to create was not me. It was the truth, and it was spreading like wildfire. That Saturday, what started as a conversation with my Marine buddy Jim and a few other concerned neighbors in my driveway organically grew into an impromptu town hall meeting. People just started showing up. They brought lawn chairs and coolers. By 11 a.m., there were nearly 50 people gathered, a cross-section of the entire community, young families, retirees, blue-collar workers, white-collar professionals. We were all there, united by a common enemy. I stood on my driveway leaning against the hood of my truck, and I let them talk. I didn't need to grandstand. The anger in the air was palpable. One by one, people stood up and shared their stories. A young father, red-faced with anger, described how Karen had fined him for his children's basketball hoop, calling it a temporary structure of a non-permanent nature that was visually displeasing. He'd taken it down, but the injustice still stung. Then Mrs. Gable, holding my wife Sarah's hand for support, stood up. In a voice that started as a quaver but grew stronger with every word, she told everyone about the fines for her paint color and Karen's threat to put a lien on her home. You could have heard a pin drop. When she finished, a wave of protective anger washed over the crowd. Men twice Karen's size were shaking their heads in disgust. Women were comforting Mrs. Gable, assuring her she wasn't alone. This was the turning point. This was the moment a collection of disgruntled homeowners became a unified force. Jim, my Marine friend, took charge of organizing. "All right, listen up," he boomed, his parade ground voice cutting through the chatter. "This is classic bully tactics. She picks us off one by one, but she can't fight all of us, not if we're organized." He proposed we form an official committee, the Concerned Homeowners of Oakwood Creek. A motion was made, and it passed by a unanimous shout. We needed a war chest, so we passed a hat. People threw in 20s, 50s, even a few $100 bills. We collected over $2,000 in less than 10 minutes. Jim knew a lawyer, a sharp guy who specialized in corporate and real estate law. He owes me a favor, Jim said with a grin, and he hates bullies. By the end of the meeting, we had a name, a bank account, legal representation on retainer, and a clear mandate. The committee's first official act was to formally endorse the petition for the financial audit and to draft a letter to the board demanding they cease all collection activities on outstanding fines until the audit was complete and the legitimacy of the new guidelines could be determined by the membership. The battle lines were no longer just between Karen and me. They were drawn between Karen and her two cronies on one side and the overwhelming majority of the community on the other. Her mass email, intended to be a show of force, had served as our rallying cry. She had inadvertently assembled the very army that would march on her castle. And all the while the clock was ticking down to the zoning board hearing, the public stage where her reign of terror would finally be brought into the light. The official notice for the hearing arrived a week later. It was printed on plain county letterhead, formal and devoid of emotion. "You are hereby summoned to appear before the County Zoning Board of Appeals," it began. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday the 18th at 7 p.m. in the main hearing room at the county government complex. The notice listed the case number, the parties involved, complainant, Oakwood Creek HOA, represented by Karen Miller, president, respondent Mark Davis, property owner, and the agenda. At the bottom of the page was the standard list of the sitting board members who would preside over the proceedings. The first name on that list, followed by his title, was mine, Mark Davis, chairman. I imagined Karen receiving the same notice. I pictured her scanning it, her eyes likely glossing over the list of board members, her mind so singularly focused on her impending victory that she wouldn't even register the name. It was a failure of imagination, a blind spot born of pure, unadulterated hubris. She couldn't conceive of a world where the little man she was trying to crush was, in fact, the one holding the gavel. With the hearing date locked in, our newly formed homeowners committee, guided by our lawyer, launched its preemptive legal strike. The lawyer, a sharp-witted man named Ben Carter, drafted a formidable cease and desist letter. It was addressed to Karen Miller and the other two board members by name, both in their capacity as board members and as individuals. The letter formally put them on notice for a litany of potential wrongdoings: breach of fiduciary duty for mismanaging HOA funds, violating the HOA's own bylaws by passing rules without a membership vote, and engaging in a pattern of targeted harassment and selective enforcement. It attached a copy of our petition for the financial audit and stated that any attempt to obstruct or delay this audit would be met with immediate legal action. It also referenced the upcoming zoning hearing, noting with pointed formality that Mr. Davis would be seeking to have the HOA cover his legal fees for what was clearly a frivolous and malicious complaint. We sent the letter via courier, requiring a signature upon receipt. It was a declaration that we were no longer playing defense, we were setting the terms of engagement. Karen's response was predictable. 2 days later, Ben Carter received a blustering, indignant letter from the HOA's lawyer. It was a weak, boilerplate response accusing our committee of slander and intimidation and threatening a countersuit. Ben just laughed when he read it to me over the phone. "This is what a guilty party does when they have no legal leg to stand on," he said. "They get loud. They make threats. Don't worry, Mark. They've got nothing." The night before the hearing, Sarah and I were in the dining room. I had spread every piece of paper related to the case across the large oak table. It was a mountain of documentation. The original HOA bylaws, highlighted and annotated, Karen's threatening letters and emails, the county zoning violation notice, my pristine property survey, the thick stack of photographs documenting her hypocrisy and the violations of her cronies, the signed affidavits from Mrs. Gable and the father with the basketball hoop, the petition for the audit, the correspondence between our lawyers. It was a physical timeline of her arrogance and my methodical response. Sarah stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder, looking at the sprawling paper trail. "It's a lot," she said softly. "All this for a fence." I shook my head, tapping the very first letter from Karen, the one that had started it all. "It was never about the fence," I said. She used paperwork as a weapon to bully people. She thought she could bury us in notices and fines and legal threats. I looked up at her, a sense of grim finality settling over me. Tomorrow we're going to bury her in it instead. There was nothing left to do but wait for the curtain to rise. The stage was set, the actors knew their parts, or at least I knew their parts, and the audience was gathering. Karen was walking into a public hearing expecting a simple zoning dispute. She was about to find herself in a trial with her entire reign as HOA president on the docket and an audience full of her victims watching from the pews. And the judge, for all intents and purposes, was me. The county government complex was a modest 2-story brick building, utilitarian and unassuming. The main hearing room on the second floor was designed for function, not comfort. It had drab institutional carpeting, fluorescent lighting that hummed with a faint, electric buzz, and rows of hard-backed wooden chairs for the public. At the front of the room was a long, elevated dais where the 5 members of the Zoning Board of Appeals sat. I arrived at 6:30 p.m., a full 30 minutes early. I was wearing my best charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a conservative navy blue tie. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a public servant there to do a job. I greeted the other 4 board members as they arrived: Eleanor, a retired architect; Bob, a real estate developer; Maria, a civil engineer; and Frank, a local business owner. We were a good board, a mix of expertise and common sense, and we had a solid working relationship built on mutual respect. They knew I was on the docket as a respondent tonight, the clerk had informed them, and I had personally told them I would be recusing myself from any vote. They just nodded, trusting my judgment. At 6:45, I took my seat. Not in the audience, not at the respondents' table, but in the center chair behind the dais, the one with the small brass plaque that read Chairman. The room began to fill. Sarah arrived and gave me a small, reassuring smile before taking a seat in the front row. Then came the others. Jim the Marine sat next to her, his back ramrod straight. Mrs. Gable came in looking nervous but determined, flanked by the young couple who had lost their playset. Soon, the public seating was packed. More than 60 residents of Oakwood Creek had shown up, a silent, formidable wall of witnesses. They weren't there to shout or protest. They were there to bear witness. At precisely 6:58 p.m., Karen Miller made her grand entrance. She swept into the room flanked by her 2 board cronies and the HOA's lawyer, a slick-looking man in a suit that was a little too shiny. Karen was dressed for what she clearly believed was her coronation. She wore a severe navy blue power suit, her shoulders padded like a linebacker's, and she carried a massive 3-ring binder that looked heavy enough to anchor a small boat. She surveyed the packed room with a look of smug satisfaction, completely misreading the audience. She thought they were there to see her triumph. She gave a little nod, as if accepting their adulation, and strode confidently to the complainant's table directly facing the dais. She sat down, arranged her binder and papers, and pointedly avoided making eye contact with any of the board members. Her focus was on the performance she was about to give. The clock on the wall ticked to 7 o'clock. I took a sip of water, leaned into the microphone, and tapped the gavel lightly on its block. The sound was a sharp, definitive crack that cut through the low murmur of the room. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm and amplified by the room's sound system. "The Thursday, October 18th session of the County Zoning Board of Appeals is now in session. We have one item on our docket this evening. The clerk will please read the case." The county clerk, a woman named Patricia, read from her notes in a clear monotone. Case 734-B, a complaint filed by the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association regarding the location and materials of a fence at the property of 1287 Willow Lane, and a subsequent appeal of the county inspector's finding of no violation. "Thank you, Patricia," I said. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat. I looked directly at the complainant's table. "Before we begin, a procedural note is in order. I let my eyes meet Karen's for the first time. As the property owner and respondent in this case, I, Mark Davis, chairman of this board, will be recusing myself from any vote or deliberation on this matter. However, as is my duty and prerogative as chairman, I will preside over the hearing to ensure it is conducted in a fair and orderly manner according to the established rules of procedure. The effect was instantaneous and glorious. The blood drained from Karen Miller's face. Her smug, self-satisfied expression collapsed like a punctured balloon, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. Her jaw went slack. Her eyes darted from me to the brass plaque in front of me and back to me again, the gears in her mind grinding as they struggled to process the reality of the situation. Her lawyer, who had been whispering something to her, froze mid-sentence, his face a comical picture of dawning horror. A low, shocked whisper rippled through the audience section, followed by a thick, delicious silence. Karen had marched her army onto the battlefield, only to discover the enemy general was also the one who wrote the rules of war and would be judging the outcome. The trap had been sprung. I allowed the moment to hang in the air for a few seconds longer, letting the full weight of the situation settle on Karen and her lawyer. Then I moved on with brisk, dispassionate professionalism, as if this were the most normal hearing in the world. We will now hear from the complainant. Ms. Miller, you and your counsel may approach the podium to present your case. Karen looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. She sat frozen in her chair, her mouth opening and closing silently. Her lawyer, whose name was Mr. Finch, recovered first. He leaned over and whispered frantically in her ear, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He was likely explaining just how catastrophic this development was. After a moment, he straightened up, gave her a slight push, and they both rose unsteadily to their feet. They walked to the complainant's podium, which stood in the center of the room, facing the board. Karen clutched her massive binder to her chest like a shield. Ms. Miller, I said, my voice even, you have the floor. She fumbled with the binder, dropping a sheaf of papers on the floor. Her cronies, sitting at the table behind her, looked at each other in panic. She took a deep, shuddering breath and began. Her presentation, which I'm sure she had practiced in front of a mirror for hours, was a complete and utter disaster. The booming, authoritative voice she had used in my front yard was gone, replaced by a high, reedy quaver. She tried to read from her prepared notes, but her hands were shaking so badly she kept losing her place. The fence at 1287 Willow Lane is a blatant, she stammered, a blatant violation of county code and our community's aesthetic. She tried to project authority, but every word was laced with the panicked realization that she was speaking to a panel of experts chaired by the very man she was accusing. She cited the wrong ordinances, just as she had in the complaint. She talked about harmony and property values in vague, meaningless terms. Her lawyer tried to jump in and salvage the presentation, but he was just as flustered. He kept looking up at me, then at the other board members, as if pleading for a way out of this nightmare. When they finally mercifully finished their disjointed and unconvincing presentation, I said, "Thank you, Mr. Finch, Miss Miller. Please return to your table." Then I looked to my right. The board may now ask questions of the complainant. Eleanor, the retired architect, went first. "Ms. Miller," she began, her voice sharp and precise, "you cited County Ordinance 204C regarding fence height. Are you aware that said ordinance applies only to commercial properties and that residential properties like Mr. Davis's fall under Ordinance 117A, which allows for fences up to 6 feet? Karen stared blankly. The board was advised." Her lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! My client is not a zoning expert." I overruled him without missing a beat. Overruled. She filed the complaint, Mr. Finch. She is expected to understand what she is complaining about. Mrs. Miller, please answer the question." Karen stammered, I was not aware." Bob, the developer, leaned forward. "Ms. Miller, Your complaint also alleges a violation of the conservation easement setback. The county inspector's report, which we all have a copy of, states that the fence is fully compliant. Do you have any professional survey data or evidence to contradict the county's own inspector? We dispute the inspector's finding, Finch blurted out. On what grounds? Maria, the engineer, asked bluntly. Do you have a conflicting survey? No, but... So you have no evidence, Maria stated, cutting him off. You just disagree? The humiliation was palpable. They were being systematically dismantled by experts, their baseless complaint exposed for the sham it was. After a few more brutal questions, I cut it off. Thank you. That will be all for now. I paused, then made my next move. The board will now hear from the respondent. I stood up from my chairman's seat, walked down the short steps from the dais, and strode to the respondent's podium. I didn't bring a binder. I carried a single slim manila folder. I placed it on the lectern and looked up at my fellow board members, then let my gaze sweep across Karen's horrified face. Members of the board, I began, my voice strong and clear. My name is Mark Davis, and I am the owner of the property at 1287 Willow Lane. I will not waste your time refuting a complaint that has already been proven baseless by the county's own inspector and by the complainant's clear misunderstanding of the law. I opened the folder. Instead, I would like to provide some context, because this complaint has nothing to do with zoning law and everything to do with a pattern of harassment and abuse of power by Ms. Miller in her role as HOA president. A gasp went through the room. Karen shot bolt upright in her chair. Her lawyer was on his feet. Objection. This is not relevant to the zoning matter. On the contrary, Mr. Finch, it is entirely relevant, I said, my voice like steel. The county's resources have been wasted on a frivolous complaint. It is this board's duty to understand why. Your objection is noted and overruled. Please sit down. He sat, his face ashen. For the next 15 minutes, I calmly and methodically laid out the entire story. I presented the board with my original approved fence application. I showed them Karen's aesthetic mandate and explained how it violated the HOA's own bylaws. I submitted the affidavits from Mrs. Gable and the other homeowners. I presented the time-stamped photos of Karen's own property, detailing her numerous violations of the very rules she was trying to enforce on others. This complaint, I concluded, was not filed in good faith. It was an act of retaliation against me for questioning her authority and an attempt to intimidate other residents into silence. It is an abuse of the zoning process and an insult to this board. I closed my folder and looked at the 4 people who would decide the matter. I rest my case. The room was dead silent. I walked back to my seat on the dais. The board will now vote on the complaint, I announced. All in favor of dismissing the complaint with prejudice? Eleanor, Bob, Maria, and Frank all raised their hands instantly. The motion carries 4-0 with the chair abstaining. The complaint is dismissed. This matter is closed. I banged the gavel. This hearing is adjourned. The aftermath was pure chaos for Karen Miller, and quiet, profound satisfaction for the rest of us. The moment I banged the gavel and adjourned the meeting, a collective sigh of relief and victory swept through the audience, as Karen, her 2 shell-shocked cronies, and her now useless lawyer tried to make a discreet exit. They found their path blocked. Not by a mob, but by a silent, unmoving crowd of their neighbors. The homeowners of Oakwood Creek, led by Jim and Sarah, simply stood in the hallway outside the hearing room, forming a quiet, formidable gauntlet. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They just stared. The weight of 60 pairs of eyes filled with disappointment, anger, and newfound strength was more damning than any verbal assault could ever be. I watched from the doorway as Karen's face, already pale from her public humiliation, turned a blotchy, panicked red. Her escape route was cut off. Just then, a local news reporter and a cameraman, whom Jim had anonymously tipped off about a major community dispute with a public official, rounded the corner. The camera's light flicked on, illuminating Karen's terrified face. The reporter stepped forward, microphone extended. Ms. Miller, I'm with Channel 8 News. Can you give us a comment on the board's dismissal of your complaint and the allegations of harassment and financial mismanagement within your HOA? Karen froze like a deer in the headlights, stammered something incoherent, and then physically shoved her way through the crowd, her cronies trailing in her wake like pilot fish. The image of her fleeing down the hallway was broadcast on the 11 o'clock news that night. Her reign was effectively over. The fallout was swift and total. The news story galvanized the remaining undecided homeowners. The following week, the Concerned Homeowners of Oakwood Creek Committee, using the procedures outlined in the original bylaws I had uncovered, formally called for a special meeting of the association for the purpose of holding a recall vote. The meeting was held in the local elementary school cafeteria, and the turnout was massive. Ben Carter, our lawyer, presided to ensure everything was above board. We presented the findings of the financial audit, which we had finally forced through. It revealed exactly what we suspected. Thousands of dollars in HOA funds had been spent on the HOA lawyer not for community business, but for drafting threatening letters and pursuing Karen's personal vendettas, including the frivolous zoning complaint. It was a clear breach of her fiduciary duty. One by one, homeowners stood up and spoke, their voices no longer trembling with fear, but ringing with resolve. When the vote was called to recall Karen Miller and her two allies from the board, the result was a landslide. They were stripped of their power by the very people they had sought to control. A new board was elected on the spot. My friend Jim, the Marine, was unanimously voted in as the new president. Mrs. Gable, beaming, was elected secretary. The young father who'd been fined for the basketball hoop was now in charge of the architectural committee. Their first act as the new board was to hold an immediate vote. They unanimously declared Karen's aesthetic cohesion mandate and all associated rules and fines null and void, effective immediately. They passed a motion to issue a formal, written apology to every homeowner who had been targeted and to refund every penny of the unjust fines that had been collected. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a few weeks later. I was in my backyard watching Gunnar chase a tennis ball, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. The split-rail fence, the silent protagonist of this whole drama, stood strong and proud. Jim walked up, a cheerful grin on his face. He wasn't wearing a power suit. He was in jeans and a polo shirt. He handed me an envelope from the HOA. "You're not fining me again, are you?" I asked, my tone dry. He laughed. "Hardly. Open it." Inside was a check made out to the Concerned Homeowners of Oakwood Creek for the full amount we had paid to our lawyer. In the memo line, Jim had written, "Community Restoration Fund." "The new board voted," he said. "We're not just about enforcing rules. We're about fixing what's broken. You guys fronted the money to save the neighborhood. It's only right the neighborhood pays you back." We stood there for a moment, two veterans who had found a different kind of battle to fight on the home front. The sense of peace was profound. It wasn't just the quiet of the evening or the beauty of the woods behind my house. It was the quiet of a community at ease, of justice served, of a small-time tyrant deposed not by force but by patience, strategy, and the simple, powerful act of neighbors standing together. I looked at my fence, no longer a symbol of conflict, but a symbol of resilience. It had cost me time and stress, but in the end, it had helped me build something far more important than a boundary for my dog. It had helped us rebuild our community.